I'd like to ask our next guest, Abhay Adhikari. While they move the table away, you can come up here front for a minute. So he is the director of Diane Design, and he's worked in the past years with various different organizations, also with Google News Lab to develop radical experiments to engage audiences online. When I talked to him yesterday, a couple of words kept popping up. There was, of course, journalism, but there was voice, identity, community, and really impact, right? So he's going to put those words together in a nice presentation and explain a little bit about what he does in these radical experiments with a couple of concrete examples. So the platform is yours, or the podium is yours, and then we'll take a couple of questions and answers then afterwards. Okay,
Great.
Go ahead, Abhay.
Morning, guys. No pressure. Thanks for that introduction. I somehow have to make sense of all of that. I've taken lots of notes, which I'll refer to later on, because I think everything I want to talk about has been said before in the past 1 hour, which is actually kind of comforting. I'm going to talk about this idea that our stories need a digital identity, but I'm also going to propose that this is not a technology-led digital identity. It's nice if you have AR stories, data stories, Facebook stories, Instagram stories, that's great. That's not what the digital identity is. I'm going to talk about an identity that is set by the context. How do we introduce our stories to this white noise, which is the internet, and how does that create a digital afterlife? And since it's the Media Innovation Lab Day, I'm going to give you lots of examples. Through those examples, I want to try and build a profile of who I think is the ideal media innovator. You may take this as a provocation, but I look forward to your response to my definition. All the examples are going to be journalists that we've been working with and who've run really interesting experiments with context. So for me, I've given up on having a job title. I'm a digital insert buzzword here, which changes with this season. But thankfully, what I'm able to hold on to when it comes to digital, which is my interest, is I'm really interested in the smallest unit of change, which is one person, regardless of the sector, regardless of the industry, regardless of the size of your organization. This one person, and how can digital help them create impact? This work has been described as deeply boring, unsexy, and bullshit in a world that is obsessed with scale. That's absolutely fine. Because I think in this age where the permanent narrative is about technology-led euphoria, we really need to keep asking the question, but why? And so what? But we need to go beyond the theoretical aspects of asking these questions and also create an alternative definition of what good practice can look like. And that's the area that I'm working on. The other point why we need to ask these questions in the context of journalism is because this damn toolkit keeps growing. You know, you've got augmented reality, you've got drones, data, artificial intelligence. You mentioned blockchain. I was waiting for someone to mention blockchain, social media. So I'm not a technophobe. Can they define the future of journalism? Listen, I've worked with some or all of these tools at some point, and my immediate answer is yes. But then there's, not to be dramatic, there's crippling self-doubt as well to say, okay, sure, but how? We need to answer two questions. One has already been mentioned extensively, which is the question of access. So maybe you're telling the most powerful story ever, and you're using, I don't know, some mind-blowing technology, but if your community cannot access that narrative, what is the point of that story? We discovered that firsthand when we were doing a project around domestic violence, and everyone got really excited, even about WhatsApp. But then we realized that in rural communities, women can't access WhatsApp, or their access is highly restricted. So what's the point of using that channel? Shouldn't we solve that problem first? And the other point I also want to make is, can we stop calling stories content? That makes them immediately banal. We're all doing storytelling. We need to figure out how do we reach people, and who do these stories empower? The next point, okay, a lot of people have already said journalists should be doing this, journalists should be doing that. I've been in many newsrooms where there's a new toolkit, and then there's a new set of pressures to deliver this undefinable thing called engagement. Can we stop that and also start answering the questions, how are journalists, let's call them analog, old school, whatever, I don't buy those definitions. How are journalists who hold on to those principles, how are they redefining their roles in spite of this pressure to deliver, and how are they getting anything done? Can we please look at that space to find what good practice looks like? So it was to try and answer these two questions that we embarked on a project, which is Digital Identities. It was powered by Google News Initiative. It began as a pilot in Sweden. We've now, 2 years later, worked with 250 journalists in 12 countries, from 12 countries. And we've launched many experiments where these people are setting really interesting context for their stories, very often using social media. Here's a sample of some of the newsrooms that we've worked with, all sorts of scale, all sorts of operations. And the purpose of each experiment is, how far does my story reach? Who does it empower? And what is the impact? Each experiment begins with the smallest unit of change, and you might recognize this profile, one journalist in a very busy newsroom with a lot of pressures, and often no time to think these questions through. So having worked with so many journalists, several archetypes have emerged. I'm going to talk about 3. And through these, I'm going to build a profile of what is the ideal media innovator. Now, these archetypes in themselves aren't remarkable. We have the storyteller, we have the provocateur, and we have the entertainer. What's really interesting is who is setting which context. So the 3 profiles I'm going to talk about is the investigative journalist, the broadcaster, and the science journalist, science reporter. Neha Dixit is from India. She's an investigative journalist. When I started working with her through our program, what really surprised me was the first question she asked, have you read any of my stories? And I thought she meant fiction, and I said no, and she was really insulted. But the thing is, she sees herself as a storyteller, because whether it's about bribery in the pharma industry or it's about communal violence and deaths, she's saying, I will present all my subjects as well-rounded characters. Forget the platform right now. She's on many platforms. So how does this have an impact? So we were working with Neha when she had to create 20 stories on gender in 1 month. Now we all know you can go and talk about gender, and as a female journalist, you will end up with 1 million dick pics in your inbox. In spite of that, how do you create impact? So she said, you know what, I'm not going to pander to the stereotypes when it comes to gender reporting. I'm going to look at the vast middle in our society, and then I'm going to look at gender in relation to that. And every story had a really interesting character, which was central to that story. How does that translate into impact? The national newspaper for which she was writing these stories, people spent 5 times more time reading her story as compared to everything else. So now I'm starting to hint towards that big buzzword, which is scale. Let me talk about Amanda Aronczyk. She works with New York Public Radio, and she's a science reporter. When I first met Amanda, she said, listen, I am an entertainer. Having worked a lot in academia, I know that entertainment in academia doesn't really go well because the instant reaction is, oh, you're going to dump stuff down. But her take is, listen, if we don't bother to create access, why is anyone else going to care? How does that create impact? So 2016, as you know, there was an election. And she ran a project with a neuroscientist and a political scientist, and she got over 100 people to donate saliva samples. Nothing about that sounds exciting unless you're a geek like me, okay? But what was really interesting was the way she shared the journey of that project to reach out to wider communities. It was deeply polarized communities to present an alternative view about the election, about how it's making us as individuals really anxious. And that story, I'm going to hint at scale, went viral. Then let me talk about Hessel. He's a broadcast journalist from the Netherlands. Now, he's a provocateur, but he's an internal provocateur. He's going around the newsroom asking people, listen, why can't we share our process? And if we share our process, how much of it can we share and maintain our journalistic integrity? How did this play out? So we met him when he was organizing every year, there's a food collection drive. And this year, when we were working with him, he said, let's share all of our process. Instead of just telling the others our story, let them be part of our story. Let's try and solve problems together. And the collections that year were 10,000. They went up to what is now 100,000 donations, and that's also in the light of reduced anti-migrant or racist backlash. I'm not going into too many details here. You'll find examples. I'll share the link later on. But that's an impact and scale of sharing your process. So what's going on here? I've talked about 3 very different people in 3 different cultural contexts with different kinds of access to technologies, both for themselves as journalists and their communities. If I try and summarize that, I think it's not for me or anyone else in the room to tell journalists what to do. I think we have to give journalists some time to reimagine their roles, which is what these people are doing. And as their ideas evolve, as their stories evolve, they're looking around at technologies and they're saying, how do I become a bit more playful? How do I repurpose? I need to figure out what's in it for me. And ultimately, all of these people, they're trying to build better bridges with communities. And they're trying to achieve impact. Given the theme of this event, I've talked about, I'm not suggesting beyond this we only all need to be activists, but the examples that I've mentioned are sort of aligned to the theme of this event. Now, this is what I call contextual digital literacy. I think we all need time to build this literacy. The beauty of this literacy is it's platform agnostic. It's really depressing to see armies of people trained to use Twitter and Instagram and whatever the channel, soul-destroying Snapchat. That's fine if you enjoy it, but we don't need train people to use just one channel. But the problem with contextual digital literacy is that it requires a period of discovery. We start with that 1 unit of change. We need to give people time to figure out what's in it for me. And time is something that all of us don't have. So maybe an ideal media innovator is contextually aware, is platform agnostic, and is time poor. So this is kind of a useless definition. Well, how are we going to do anything with this? So I want to introduce one final characteristic, again starting with the smallest possible unit of change. I'm going to talk about Sarah Cheverton. We met her when we were doing a project called Destination Local, run by my colleague Catherine Giles. Now she lives in Portsmouth, and this was at a time when the local council had 11 UKIP councillors. So her point is, listen, I need to be a frame of reference for change in my community. Sarah had a news website, The Star and Crescent. At the time, it was barely visible on social media. You couldn't even search for it. And this was also at the time when the local council was going to cut the domestic violence services. So what Sarah did, which was brilliant, was she said, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. She went online and she found a global movement called They Cut, We Bleed. And then she spent a lot of time and energy understanding how do I become a frame of reference for this movement which is on social media in a very analog way. Someone talked about analog. And through that, she was able to be noticed by existing networks, and she was able to activate relationships. So in 5 days, they got the council to back off from making cuts of £180,000. But her story doesn't end here. Now she is known by many other networks. She creates an informant network from the council, and she's released a couple of stories that were then picked up by the BBC and The Guardian. And at this current point, she's building capacity because she's training other citizens to also work as investigative reporters in her city. So again, she, through her definition of impact, she's found a way to scale sustainably. So maybe the ideal media innovator is contextually aware, is platform agnostic, is time poor, but I would say they are also obsessed with this idea of impact. And impact is something deeply personal. And when we are working with this program, we always ask people, so, okay, imagine your story is read. What happens afterwards? That sort of removes the pressure in the short term that I need to chase the metrics. It's about I need to really focus on what will happen afterwards. What's the digital afterlife of my story? And what I propose here, through the anecdotal evidence that we've gathered, is if you get all the elements right, scale will then happen. But you need to give it time. So what next for us? We continue to apply this idea of contextual digital literacy with journalists from all over, multiple platforms, and we're focusing on all sorts of issues, from fake news to cultural engagement, gender, and climate change. What I'm also starting to do is create a record of these experiments and really emphasize the point that most of these people who are working with, they start with a question, can I? How can I? Isn't it possible? So it's more about capturing these people's intuitions, and hopefully that inspires you as well to form your experiments. Thank you.
Okay, so Abhay, I said in the beginning, I'm glad somebody's talking about storytelling. As a journalist, these are issues that are really at the heart of why I do this and why many other people do this too. But we're not individuals only. We usually sit and work in that very busy newsroom you described. So I know that when you present this, a lot of people are, yeah, right. That's not realistic. What is one of the main objections you face, and how do you counter that?
Okay. When a unit of change is trying to do a project like this, he or she is countered by this idea that how will it scale? So the sad reality is a lot of these projects start under the radar. That's one thing. But a place where you can have an immediate impact is you look around you and see how can you start building capacity through offline networks. So a lot of the colleagues, whether they're in big newsrooms or they're in hyperlocals, their first instinct is, how do I find allies? How do I build capacity? And I'm not saying this in an activist way, in a very tactical way. Who else can contribute resources to what I'm trying to do? So I start to show some results.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then I have a question too, because you talk about impact and you said it's deeply personal. I think that's also an important point to make, that when we talk about impact and the afterlife, it's a great way of working at the afterlife, we're not necessarily talking about activism. It's not that the journalist has to be an activist for a political agenda. I mean, we talked yesterday, and the impact could be somebody said, might have even laughed or cried reading that, might have shared it, might have just said, okay, now I understand the world better. What are the media outlets then saying what their intended impact is, and how does that shape the way they go about structuring what they do and the types of stories they tell?
So there's an interesting tension there. For most media organizations, if you take a step back, impact for them is always about metrics, which leads to revenue. Impact for a journalist is very different. So impact for a journalist, if you remove the activism, is how can I get the reader to have just that little moment where he or she can step out of himself and look at an issue. So I'll go back to my point again, where I'm saying what we're trying to do is figure out how journalists meet that impact. But then if you then, through that, you tap into new communities. I also want to remove this notion that we all have to reach out to target audiences. You know, the person who talked about analog. I think if you are working with analog, the other sense that we're trying to create with journalists is, okay, your target audience does not exist. What you do have is people online who engage in certain sets of behaviors that will make them want to engage with you. So the idea of impact we're looking at to help journalists scale is, okay, I want readers to have a moment where they step outside of themselves, but at the end of the day, what is the community that I want to build online? People who will do something with me or for me. And having that sense of ownership also helps you ultimately scale.
Okay. Any questions? Way back there in the back. Let's see if we can get a microphone for you. No microphones? Oh, okay. Please also introduce yourself briefly.
Hey, my name is Jamal. I come from Palestine originally, but I live in Belgium, and I'm an academic. Also a video blogger in architecture. One of the very few video blogs about architecture in the world. What you just said today was one of the most informative things I've heard in this conference, and very relevant for what I'm doing, because it's in between academia, activism, spreading education, and also fighting extremism. So it's very relevant, and I really thank you. It was really nice. The question is, the narrative we are using in educational videos is a bit different from activism or when we want people to do something. Still, mixing them, I think, is the best to get people doing something while they are educated. Mm-hmm. But I don't know how can I reach that.
Wow, okay. I was waiting for the tricky question after all of those nice things you said. I think there's a two-part thing. One is this idea of building better bridges, where if I can give a very quick example, we were doing some work in Sweden with an organization which was about reaching out to younger audiences, but they were very aware that younger audiences don't care about them. So what the institution decided to do was, okay, let's stop obsessing about the younger audience that is the target audience and find a bridge between us and the target audience. And can that bridge then be a message. So again, you're activating an analog network using social networks. At the end of the day, this institution ended up working with cosplayer communities, which was a total culture shock for them, but they were the ideal filter to pass the message on, which led to a 60% increase in engagement. So point one is build a bridge. Second one, okay, we're all activists in our own way, but do we really want to communicate the burden of the big picture to everyone and ultimately make them feel helpless? Take a step outside and say, does your narrative also have a point perhaps of why you care about what you're doing or why someone else should care? This is a buzzword that I want to introduce here, but I want to appropriate it in an ethical way. What is the nudge that you are creating? What's the one thing someone can do, regardless of whether it's online or offline, instead of just carrying the burden of the big picture with them and feeling utterly helpless?
Does the issue of constructive journalism come in there? Because if you're talking about we communicate the big picture, we saw in the keynote speech, we saw young people, the next generation, almost 90% of them are concerned about not having access to water, food, natural resources. Do we just keep on reporting that? Or do we need to, as journalists, find a way to present them with solutions?
No, I think you are trying to present the problem and then second-guess the solution by doing that. I think you can present the problem, but you also need to figure out what you bring back once you present the problem. And I think that there's often a disconnect. We're all putting stuff out there, and I know it's not always possible, but through our project we're trying to see, once you put stuff out there, what do you get back in return? And does that inform the next step?
Okay. More questions? Yes, right here.
Hi, first of all, really nice talk. I found it really, I could associate with it because I'm also working in a field where it's half journalism and half activism. So my question is, can you give some examples of the bridges people can create with the viewer? Should journalists focus on the emotional impact of the reader or the target audience?
Okay, fun question. I think I can give you a general answer. What you have to invest in is this period of discovery. I think we need to figure out, I talked about this idea of behaviors. We need to figure out who else is prepared to listen to us. So that's how you find your bridge. The cosplayer example is a completely unexpected bridge that people discovered. Another one, again, because I'm doing a lot of projects focused at the young people. There's an institution in Spain who's trying to reimagine the urban environment. And you can start that conversation speaking to the architects and the policymakers. But what they're trying to do is figure out, okay, cities around us are rapidly changing. So how do we become more playful? So the bridge for them is the skateboarder community. And what they're doing here, to add to your point, is they're first investing time in learning the rules of engagement, so that they don't go to the community saying, here's the problem, here's the solution, what do you think? They're consciously making a decision to say, why don't you tell us what you think and how we become a platform to amplify your voice and then work together. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks a lot, that was really nice.
Good. More questions? No? Okay, then I have a couple more questions coming back to this newsroom. What kind of infrastructure do you need in the newsroom to enable these journalists? You say they work under the radar, but at some point they move out of the radar and they have to be functioning, they have to publish it. So what is the single most important thing for that newsroom to have in order to allow these archetypes to grow?
Okay, I'll start with the general answer, which is the way we work is the first step is to figure out what do you already have, because there's a lack of awareness very often. In most media organizations, sadly, innovation is a tiny hub. Yeah? So we need to look at that space and say what is available to us and start working with those resources and then try and scale is the answer. I take a platform agnostic approach, so it's about figuring out what problem you want to solve. I will say social media and social networks is a very good way to start, but if you use it as a discovery tool, A, don't position it as a place for spreading content, and B, use it responsively. We did a project with a certain organization that had to talk about, now I'm stepping away from activism, that had to talk about property. A news organization has a slightly right-wing agenda to it. So the problem was that every time they would try to talk about property, they would come under attack. So they needed to understand how we as a vertical increase our traffic. And all they started to do was, okay, for a bit, stop adding to the white noise of content and just become a little bit more responsive. If we want to talk about rural property prices, who else is talking about these themes? What is the tone? What is the voice? Who is aggregating around these discussions? How can we respond to their needs? And over a 3-month window, just using social tools to find that community to then drive traffic to their website, international numbers went from 5 to 10 million. So it's discovery. Stop thinking about your stuff as content.
Okay, so using the platforms then to discover what's out there, to discover the issues that may be of interest, and then listening, basically. What all journalists should be doing anyway is listening and observing.
Absolutely, because I think we have to learn how we become a frame of reference for something else. Very often when you're releasing a big story, you are the only frame of reference. Like Sarah did in her project, she wanted to talk about domestic violence, and if she had started up from the ground up, it would have taken her months and years to raise consciousness about domestic violence. But she went outside of her bubble, online, and she found a trending hashtag, which is They Cut, We Bleed. So there was an existing community. And her effort was, how do I become a frame of reference for this existing thing?
Another question here?
So this leads me to direct to my question. We as journalists and media often think that we can create communities because we are thinking, okay, we are a big media house with our reach. Do you think that we are in the position, or should we create communities, or is it more what you said before, go and find existing communities?
It's the latter. I think creating communities is not about you, but it's just a level of arrogance, and it is very resource heavy. I think you have to discover communities. It's the same that I see in the cultural sector. Everyone moans in Europe. Everyone moans about only white, middle-aged people coming to museums, and everyone else is apparently hard to reach and hard to find. The thing is, they're at your doorstep and they have amazing lives. You just need to look elsewhere in a different context. So it's the same logic that applies. Go and discover the communities that already exist. Stop trying to create them.
Any more questions? No? I have one last question because you piqued my interest. You mentioned you gave the example of the domestic violence in India, I believe it was, where they initially thought about going out and using WhatsApp to get the story to the audience. And you said they discovered that gets back to the issue of access and equalities, which is something we talked about earlier. So they decided not to use WhatsApp. What did they do?
No, they are going to continue to use WhatsApp, but it goes back to this idea of who is the bridge then? Because the other solution is either do it in an analog way, which we know is much slower, or build an alternative version of technology, which they don't want to do. Okay. So they're investing that energy in figuring out, okay, who is it that can help take our story to women? Because there are also women who are championing mobile technologies. Maybe that's a better bridge. You know, we don't have to start, there's no direct cause and relation. If you want to talk about domestic violence, find the victims. You want to talk about domestic violence, who else is there? Is that case of discovering who can then help us in this journey to increase that access. And that's not a technology answer.
Okay, good. So thank you very much. Lots of inspiration there, I think. All of the sessions we've had so far have been really giving us good ideas for thought. We're going to take